A very warm welcome to all of our guests watching on Catch Up or Live. My name is Jon Sleigh. My pronouns are he, him. Please know that this broadcast contains the word queer and will have some content warnings in terms of the content that we put forward. An incredibly warm welcome to this session, the process of queering. The Queer Heritage Network Collections Network is proudly sponsored by the Heritage Lottery Fund. The word in this, this space is very much about us and how we share and what we do. So across the first 30 minutes, it's me delving into the topic through experience, reflection, learning and emotion that I've experienced on the subject. We then shift the conversation to our lovely friends at National Museums Northern Ireland before Museums Wales to finish. Plenty of time for questions. Please do flood the chat with as many reactions and questions as you would like to. I will try to get to as many of them as possible. As with the network and as with this space, we use the word queer. I never take for granted people's comfort with this word. For many of us, it is a word that is about reclamation and power. It's a special word that talks about intersection and joy and inclusion. But for so many as well, it can be uncomfortable or deeply divisive. It can be a word or a phrase or an intonation that has been used in violence against them previously. It's a word that may have associations of a derogatory nature or deep discomfort for people. That is recognised within this space. What I aim and strive to do, though, is to both earn and deserve your trust in using this term specifically for an engagement perspective of inclusion and inclusive futures. Queer is the most inclusive term I can use when I not only talk about the queer community, but also those within it. Knowing that to objectify us based on one categorization, one letter, one way of presenting, does not always reflect the whole entirety of who we are. The intersections between so many different identities, both within and without the queer community, is absolutely essential. Therefore, using that word recognizes for me the intersection and the joy and the togetherness of so many different identities. I invite you to be part of that and join me as well. How we make warm and welcoming online queer spaces. This is a space to think and feel about curation, learning and engagement within potentially painful histories. It's responsible to others, their wellbeing journeys, and it's a very accountable space as well. Consent in terms of this discussion is absolutely key. I'll be putting forward key indicators about what to expect going forward. Please do make mindful decisions based on your well-being. An agreed environment of sharing and kindness is absolutely intrinsic in this space. Time and time again, I've been to either online spaces or physical spaces that have promised people safety. They've said, this is a safe space. You can say anything. This is a completely safe area. As queer people, I think we recognise that when people say this is a safe space, I think the automatic question that comes forward is safe for who and on whose terms. This space recognises that completely. It's not presumed, as is trust within this space. It's earned through actions and through our values. Therefore, to build a space with you based on kindness and respect is absolutely key. Words, concepts and images fully acknowledged in their capacity to hurt, offend or trigger us, but we hope to use them for inclusive futures and dialogues. History does not mitigate pain and distance on any topic, and as with myself, everyone speaks on their own perceptions, lived experience, and are not objectified based on how they're presenting. Any conversation contrary to the Equalities Act 2010 will never be supported in this space, and you're welcome to take part in any way that is comfortable for you. One-to-one, in a group, with your camera on or your camera off. Anything that you add to this space, any sharing that you give is an absolute gift. Particularly in the comments section, if you wish to share any feedback or if you wish to share any learning or advice for people in the network, we can build that into future resources going forward. Please do take part in any way that's comfortable for you. Your anonymity and privacy is also very important to us. Content notice, this session uses images and conversations around themes of prejudice, inequality, violence, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia and biphobia. That list isn't exhaustive, but suggestive of what to expect on many levels. It's really important to recognise your professional and emotional labour in this space. Know that it's a massive gift, it's a huge act of generosity, it's a way in which we enrich ourselves, it's a gift to others, and it's massively valued by myself. Please do take part in any way that is comfortable for you and mindful of your well-being. My check-in question before I get started: what emotion does the process of querying bring up for you? Please do consider that either on your own terms or in the chat. It's a powerful question and the driver behind this session and this space on the process of querying, which takes me to experience I had at the V&A, specifically working with the V&A Academy. Their collection of queer objects, both within the archive and within the collection itself, is exquisite. What's surprising in some cases, though, is that the time, the capacity intellectually and emotionally to explore these objects hasn't yet fully been realised. We presume sometimes with museum and museum institutions that everything has been done, everything has been said, because we inherit this notion of museums, heritage, the heritage sector in this country as complete. Everything has been sorted for us, everything has been catalogued for us. The museum label as tombstone tells us what to think and what to feel. The actuality of our collections nationally, regionally, and across the world is that in a number of cases, these pieces have never been explored before, either curatorially, academically, or more importantly for this space, with the lived experience of queer people. It's important to remember that when we're building on the canon of queer heritage and queer heritage collections, in the timeline of these institutions and their lives, which could be 150 years, 250 years sometimes in terms of the collecting that's happened in terms of the heritage, the ability for queer people to speak about themselves to themselves candidly in language that suits them and recognises their identity is incredibly new in some cases. It's evolving through co-production constantly, and it's a beautiful way of understanding collections like the V&A, which contains a goldmine of queer-themed involvement and conversation and care that I was able to explore with the team. Specifically, I got to choose a series of pieces from the archives, and we used them in a professional peer setting with people that were interested in exploring curation, co-curation, people that were active in terms of the industry or social care in heritage, to really find out about these questions of queering. The biggest hurdle sometimes is getting started, I found, and the process of queering is an enormous emotional, intellectual feat of labour for some. What's powerful is setting a precedent. A number of people will say, we've never queered these objects before, we've never had queer interpretation before, we've never attempted this in co-curation before. Getting over that threshold of having the confidence to queer is absolutely essential, as is looking at things with a queer filter. Therefore, we invited people in this space as a lab to actively experiment and involve themselves in changing these pieces, creating new labels, not just for themselves, but on a practical level, informing the development of these pieces within the archive. And that for me is a really important point in terms of the process of querying that I am absolutely determined on in all the work that I do. It should not be theoretical, and it should not bounce off the side. When we queer a piece, it is to fundamentally shift and change the sociology of that piece forever. How many pieces of heritage are enriched by so many beautiful pieces of lived experience, but they're never seen as valued or recorded as such. Therefore, they don't build into this longer picture of how heritage can be explored. Queering for me is one aspect of that. How many queer amazing projects have happened but haven't made it into the curatorial files or haven't been accessioned into the collection itself, or made its way into the database and search engines, collection methodology, so that we can follow that trail. It's intrinsic and important that queer sociology changes these objects permanently. The process of queering is to change the institution and the pieces. It's not to ricochet off the side. It's not to be something temporal that sits on it, but then is given permission to either leave or stay by the institution. That for me speaks of an unequal power relationship that is typifying the process of queering previously, which was by other people for queer people and not on their terms. Queering should stick to the sides of these objects, as it does to this amazing piece called The Lesbians Are Coming Out. With this, we broke down a toolkit into two different parts, which is the process for me in terms of queer heritage of how I work with these pieces. Firstly, what are the provocations for engagement? Why am I having this conversation in the first place? And with that, the associated conversation, should I be having these conversations in the first place? Am I the right person at the right time with the right resources to do so? The second consideration for me in any level of the process of querying is audience mapping. The project should not be halfway through completion, or we're reaching a stage where it's reaching gargantuous proportions, both in terms of time and labour, before audiences are considered. Audiences should be considered before the project even exists, by the nature of the pieces and the heritage that's being associated with it. Key conversations and key questions should be raised at the start. It should not be theoretical, because audiences and audience reactions are not theoretical. It should not be that heritage is put forward, consumed, and then people examine the reaction afterwards. There is an ethical and moral responsibility to consider that reaction at the inception of these projects. And I think with queerness, there's even a greater driver to that, because we're often talking about misrepresented, erased, removed, painful histories, or more keenly for me, joyous, beautiful pieces that talk about queer joy, queer liberation, and queer expression. Again, resources that heritage are not commonly found to be holding, contextually rather than in the pieces themselves. By building in the expectation that we create that, we record that, we self-reflect on that in ourselves, that for me is a crucial part of the process of querying. Another is the intangibles of querying and the feeling of querying. Now, with the previous piece, The Lesbians Are Coming, there is clear context, there is a political, there is a timeline, there is a provenance as to why that piece existed. That piece functioned within sociology and queer emerging rights. When we take that back a step though, and we look at these very generic Grecian pieces that talk about grandeur, that talk about the identity of heritage, but simultaneously give us very little of anything other than the iconography of them. For example, this piece is only called Photograph. There is no other information with it other than photograph. One of the things I found in terms of the process of querying sometimes is the shorthands that people take that I think are important, but simultaneously do need to be challenged. One of which being homoeroticism and presumed homoeroticism. That because this is a muscular, masculine presenting figure, that because it is presumptive that it will be attractive or considered attractive by other masculine or non-masculine queer people, that it's default homoerotic. Because it's got no clothes on, it must be homoerotic, because that is the thought process that queer people go through. Not care, not sociology, not love, not friendship. It goes straight to this concept of this being a sexually attractive piece. What I would question in terms of the process of querying, and one of the things I do question of the process of querying, is who says this is homoerotic? Who is it erotic for, and on whose terms? Sometimes some of the shorthands that are associated with querying are uplifting and powerful, but they can also be prejudicial to the process. Being conscious of them and having a conscious dialogue about that process, I think, is absolutely crucial, because then it takes us to these beautiful open-ended questions that use the best of heritage, but free people up in terms of emotion, in terms of time, in terms of the lived experience that they bring. They may not be experts on heritage, but they are experts on themselves, their hearts, what they think and what they feel. So, for example, asking this piece, does this feel queer? Is there a recognition of otherness in this? Without any context behind it, do we just associate it based on queer aesthetics because it's got no clothes on? Therefore, is that useful? Take it one step further. Is this art history or is this pornography? And in whose hands and in whose direction? Having these conversations and these questions dissects how we can interact with people that is purposeful, interact with people that is inclusive, and more importantly, interact with people in a way that is useful to them. Part of the questioning of querying that I would put forward is who is benefiting from the process of querying. If the institution is benefiting more from the process of querying than the communities that it serves, I would suggest that that relationship is based on an unequal power relationship and is consumptive of queer labour, queer emotion, and queer time. To have that conversation to uplift and empower people, to say that actually, with the huge levels of cultural capital that these heritage institutions have, how can we use that for your advocacy? How are we having these conversations that are intentful to uplift you, to benefit you actively? And in turn, as you benefit and as you speak about yourself and to others, how can the institution grow and incorporate that as a result? In this session, we had a beautiful time querying the labels and rewriting the labels and making new labels, which again got added to the files. When the process of querying is peer-led in the self-reflection of ourselves, there needs to be a level of transparency, I would argue, in terms of that process, because transparency is a way in which the querying process gains trust with other people. Show people the cracks in the institution, show people what went wrong, show people what went right. Leave footprints in the sand of how you got to that place in the first place, because otherwise, for me, it defaults back to this position of authoritarian heritage of we've created this, but we're not going to tell you how, and on whose terms, on who was involved in it. This is now available within the V&A, which I think is a really strong indicator of its confidence and trust within the subject. Simultaneously, the process of querying is not just didactic or academic. It can be joyful, it can be silly, it can be naughty, as is the subject matter. To refine it down to one generic voice denies the expression and beauty and joy of the queer experience, I would suggest. One participant turned around responding to one of the pieces that you can see in this, asked, "Why are Aussie sailors so gay?" Someone said what she said, pointed an arrow up to it. Allow space within the querying process for liberation and joy and silliness and flippancy, because without it, you deny the process of what querying feels like. It can be very serious, it can be very dogmatic, it can be this monolith of emotion. For some, it can also be fun, it can also be liberating and a reflection of them in themselves and the comfort levels they have with their own queer identities, often highlighting how uncomfortable heritage organisations sometimes are with our identities. The Arts Marketing Association is a really good example of the querying process going digital, and for me, following and being part of that. My reflection on this is particularly rooted around the pandemic of 2020 and the shutdown, effectively, of the heritage industry. We no longer had access to the physical sites. Digital became paramount as a way in and a vehicle for expressing ourselves, continuing the work and continuing a level of connectivity. With it, though, comes one of my famous and my utterly favourite meme of all time. Now, please excuse me, I am not a meme queen by any stretch of the imagination, and I only allow myself one a year, and this is my one from Jurassic Park. You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think whether you should. And I think for me, that's a really important conversation in terms of querying and the queer process. Just because we can digitize, just because we can share this information, does not mean that we absolve ourselves from the responsibility of handling these conversations and the specialism we bring with it in terms of expertise. One example that leaped out to me during the pandemic, which was so horrific, was this tweet from UK House of Commons when they were debating and opening up conversations around the conversion therapy bill. They put out this statement: how does conversion therapy affect the LGBT community? Should it be made illegal, and what would that mean to you? As a reductive, difficult and anger-inducing question, it's quite extraordinary, because conversion therapy is recognised by the UN, I believe, as a form of torture. Therefore, asking people, should torture be made illegal against you? What would it mean to you not to be tortured? Is not only reductive, it's offensive. This rush of queer content without queer literacy sometimes is really scary and terrifying for those of us that have the lived experience, because constantly there should be a reframing in terms of sharing of, is this okay? How do we feel about this? Are we the right people to tell this story? Are we consulting with people that have the lived experience and the veracity to tell us how this feels and what if it's right for them? The result of this was they closed the survey to better reflect the committee's aims, and further, MP Catherine McKinnell apologised for the misjudged Commons tweets that understandably people were offended by. There is a reckoning and there is a recognition in terms of putting this content out there that it's not always positive for people. However, when it goes out there and it goes out with intent and care and confidence, it's startling what can be achieved in terms of the process of querying online. Bishopsgate's Institute at the moment have just put out their adverts for their programme, and the confidence by which they attach themselves and promote queer narratives is breathtaking and beautiful, because so much care has gone into these messages. Simultaneously, the messages are not watered down. There is no dancing around the houses. There's no kind of, oh, no sex, please, we're British attitude towards it. It gives you a clear indicator as to what's inside of the conversation and a clear indicator as to the subject matter. Simultaneously, they do not back down or explain or drive away from that. It's intrinsic to what it is and who they do. As a piece of clarity transferred, it's beautiful and a really gorgeous example for me of the querying process, not only internally, but how that's communicated externally to the heritage industry and wider. One process that I worked through in the V&A was one of my tours got cancelled in 2020, which was I was going to do the Friday Late tour about Georgian beauty, which was going to include a lot about queer aesthetics and the damage and danger of Georgian makeup. That understandably got cancelled when everything shut down, therefore my content got digitised. It was a reminder to me, though, of when that content goes out there, the power of queer processes can be in terms of how we access them online. My content went from a tour that would have held about 50 people at max to on a platform that has 1.3 million people following it. The process of queerness is just about the channels that we use to contact people, where those channels come from and the veracity of those channels. Some people will never go to the V&A, never want to have a queer conversation about the V&A. They may follow them online. And I think there's an equity there in terms of, first of all, they can access it on their terms. Secondly, they access the querying process with the power of anonymity. I don't need to out myself in order to access this content. I don't need to self-declare. I don't need to spend money. I don't need to put myself in either emotional or physical danger sometimes to access this content. Recognizing that in terms of how they translated my work into a show and a show reel was really beautiful and really meaningful for me. One of the final points here is about delivery of queerness and exploring queerness. This is me as broadcast as part of BBC Digital Cities Week in Birmingham when I was doing a queer themed tour, and I was broadcast at Periscope, and I was at home for a number of people, but I was also broadcasting to some venues live across the country simultaneously. It was a reminder to me of the emotional toil sometimes of this querying process and how much we take on ourselves. I was a bit scared and I was a little bit daunted by how many people could be watching and what happened as a result of it. One of the things that I did, which was intrinsic to my process of querying, was making sure that I wasn't carrying that emotional baggage, the representation of the conversation and the institution on my own. I booked out other staff to be there. I booked out a number of staff to be present in the chat. I booked out a number of staff to be present with me in the space. It's not always about functionality in terms of the process. It's about creating an environment of care, both for queer and non-queer people that are exploring these topics. Put simply, I shouldn't have to carry the load by myself. Making sure and reminding my colleagues, both in their time and in the funding aspects of the time, that support is vital to having these conversations, is crucial, and a really good indicator in the process of querying that safeguarding is paramount. Don't be on your own in terms of these conversations. Make sure other people are present. Make sure you have the support, both professionally and emotionally, of other people as you explore this. Final stop off will be at Leeds Art Gallery, and this one is about positioning. I had the privilege this year and last to work on the exhibition Shifting Perspectives, which was a radical reinterpretation of the gallery, where they brought out work that had very strong, powerful colonial narratives around them. Some works were considered explicitly racist by visitors as they came in. Rather than hide away from these pieces and these conversations, an entire showcase and exhibition was built around them, to rebuild their context. Specifically, visitors were invited in to have conversations with members of staff and to rebuild and remake the labels themselves, changing the perception of these pieces on their terms, how they see them. Me coming into this space was amazing, because one of the things I was able to do straight away as soon as I got invited to come in and say, I'd like to talk to you about my identity, and I'd like to talk to you about what I would like to do in terms of my identity. One of them being representing my identity in terms of queerness, being a queer activist within that space. What was fascinating and powerful to me was Kanchi's Alphabet was one of the pieces in there from 2020, which dealt with colonial attitudes towards queerness, representation of queerness and queer bodies, often in environments where illegality or violence was a dominant factor and threat. To stand and have that conversation using the freedoms I have as a queer person, to be able to express that, using my agency and advocacy as a platform for others that may be invisible in that space, was absolutely crucial to me. So too was orientating myself in that space. Therefore, that's how I introduced myself, not just to the gallery, but to the visitors that came in as well. It was one part of my identity and one part of the conversation, but one part that I was determined to use for my own activism. And also for me to feel comfortable in that space, comfortable with the content matter, and comfortable articulating the vast amount of privilege I had in communicating the ideas around it. I applied that going back as our lovely running narrative, which is the V&A, going back when I visited Fashioning Masculinities recently, and emboldened not only by wanting to find out the queer content within this exhibition, but also the joy of being a visitor in a tracksuit, just enjoying myself. I went up to a member of the team, and the first thing I asked when I went in is, can you show me something really queer, please? And the member of staff I spoke to lit up with the most beautiful smile and took me to a series of locations that have been queered and actively worked with me to queer those. Have you considered this queer? Do you think this is queer? What about this? We know this has got a queer story, as in Tom of Finland. What about these pieces? What about these pieces? It was joyous and it was beautiful. And it's a reminder to me that sometimes the process of queering is about our agency as visitors, giving people the space, contextual time, and curatorial support to be able to do that process themselves. More fundamentally, not intrude on that process. Recognize that process is sacred. It is beautiful time. It's based on emotional labor. It's based on something that is very personal to them. Fundamentally, heritage has no right to these testimonies. These testimonies are given as a gift. Therefore, to receive them is all the more powerful and beautiful. Time for a couple of minutes break, my lovely friends, before we bring on our first guests. The recording is going to stop now, but otherwise, fill the comments and questions. I would love to hear them. We're going to welcome our lovely comments and questions from you, and we'll bring on our colleagues from National Museum Northern Ireland in about 2 or 3 minutes. But this is your time to refresh a cup of tea, stretch, dance, be away from the screen. I'll be with you shortly, my lovely friends.